In the summer of 1972, a farmer named Everett Coble was driving his son Nelson down a county road in Randolph County, Indiana, in the cab of a grain truck, coming back from the elevator after delivering corn from the previous day's harvest. Nelson was 16 years old. He had been on the farm every summer of his life, and during planting and harvest through every school year since he was old enough to be useful. He knew the equipment. He knew the fields. He knew which corners of the home farm held moisture past the other sections and needed to be planted last, and which sections on the east quarter dried fastest and were always the first ground in the county to support equipment weight after a wet spring. He did not yet know what his father was about to say. They were passing the Brinker farm, 280 acres on the north side of the county road, a white farmhouse set back from the road, a red equipment barn beside it, a field of standing corn behind both. Everett had farmed the county road for 22 years. He knew every farm on it. He had watched some of them change hands, had watched some of them expand, had watched some of them struggle. He had been watching the Brinker farm with specific attention for 2 years. He said, "Nelson, look at that place." Nelson looked at the Brinker farm. He said, "What am I looking at?" Everett said, "That farm is going to be in trouble in 3 years." Nelson looked at the farm again. The standing corn, the white house, the red barn, the equipment visible at the barn door. He said, "It looks fine." Everett said, "What you can see looks fine." He paused. "What you can't see is going to end it." He drove past without saying anything more for almost a mile. Then he said, "The Brinker boy bought that new machine in 1970 on a 6-year note." He paused. "He bought the East 80 in 1971 on a land note." He paused. "His operating credit is drawn to the limit every spring." He looked at the road ahead. He said, "That farm has 3 ropes holding it up, and every one of them is somebody else's rope." Nelson had said, "Somebody else's rope?" Everett had said, "When you owe, someone else holds the rope." He had paused. "When you hold the rope yourself, you decide when to let go." He had looked at Nelson. He had said, "Never let someone else hold your rope." That was the sentence. Nelson Coble had been 16 years old in the cab of a grain truck passing the Brinker farm on a July afternoon in 1972 when his father said it. He had heard it. He had not needed to hear it again. In the 12 years between that July afternoon and the farm crisis of the mid-1980s, he had made every significant financial decision on his farm with that sentence in the back of his mind. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes as a reflex that had been so thoroughly internalized that it operated without conscious articulation. 3 farms on his road lost their operations in the 1985 to 1987 period. The Brinker farm was one of them. The Kellerman farm, half a mile east, was another. The Waters operation, a mile to the west, was the third. A larger farm that had expanded aggressively in the late 1970s and had found itself unable to service the expansion debt when corn fell below $2.50, and the interest rates the expansion had been financed at did not fall with it. Nelson Coble did not lose his farm. He did not restructure. He did not have a conversation with his lender that he would have preferred not to have. He farmed through the crisis years the same way he had farmed through the good years. 280 Randolph County acres, the same equipment he had been running for a decade, the same maintenance discipline his father had taught him, the same relationship with his bank that had never been complicated by the kind of debt that requires managing. He had kept the rope. Let me tell you about Everett Cobble, because the sentence was not the whole of what Everett taught, and understanding Everett explains why the sentence had the weight it had when he said it. Everett had been farming Randolph County ground since 1950, when he had come back from the Korean War and had taken over his father's operation on a modest arrangement that had left him debt-free within 4 years. He had run the farm from that point without ever carrying an equipment note, not because equipment notes were inherently wrong, but because he had calculated in 1952 that the interest on an equipment note in a year with bad weather or low prices could be the difference between a farm that survived and a farm that did not. And he had decided he preferred not to run that risk. He had bought everything used. He had rebuilt everything himself. He had run 3 tractors across 22 years of farming before that July afternoon in 1972, and he had spent a total of $4,800 on them, purchase prices plus all rebuild costs, where a conventional upgrade path would have cost perhaps $45,000 in the same period. He had invested the difference in 2 land purchases, 40 acres in 1958 and 60 acres in 1965, both paid for with cash from the operating account that had no equipment payments draining it. He had also invested it in 1 sentence, delivered to a 16-year-old boy in a grain truck cab on a July afternoon in 1972. The sentence had cost him nothing except the clarity of having thought about the rope long enough to find the right words for it. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer and tell me in the comments, what is the 1 sentence about farming that your father or grandfather said that you have carried with you? Let me tell you about Nelson's 12 years between 1972 and the crisis, because those 12 years are where the sentence was tested and proved. Nelson had taken over the farm from Everett in 1978, when he was 22, and Everett was ready to step back from the primary work. He had taken over a 280-acre operation with 3 paid-for tractors, 1 paid-for combine, and an operating account with $28,000 in it. No equipment debt, no land debt. The land was paid for. The original home farm plus the 2 parcels Everett had bought in 1958 and 1965. Nelson had farmed for 6 years before the crisis, 1978 through 1983. And in those 6 years, the agricultural economy had swung from the expansion-era optimism of the late 1970s to the beginning of the crisis conditions of the early 1980s. Corn had peaked at $3.65 per bushel in 1980 and had fallen to $2.55 by 1982 and $2.42 by 1983. Land values, which had peaked at over $2,000 per acre in Randolph County in 1980, had begun to soften. Interest rates had peaked at 21% on farm operating credit in 1981. In those 6 years, Nelson had been offered equipment upgrade programs 3 times by the dealers in Winchester and Parker City. He had declined all 3. He had bought 1 additional tractor, a 1969 machine, at an estate auction in 1980 for $1,840, with a failed clutch that he had rebuilt over the winter, and he had done 2 engine rebuilds on existing machines. His total equipment expenditure across the 6 years, approximately $5,100. His neighbor, Harvey Kellerman, who farmed the 300 acres half a mile east, had bought a new large green machine in 1979 on a 6-year note, a new planter in 1981 on a 3-year note, and had drawn his operating credit to the maximum each spring to cover input costs that had risen with the expansion-era enthusiasm. By 1983, Harvey was carrying approximately $82,000 in combined equipment and operating debt on a farm that was producing revenue based on corn prices that had fallen 30% from their 1980 peak. Nelson was carrying approximately $800 in outstanding parts orders. The difference was not one decision. It was 12 years of decisions, each one informed by the sentence Everett had said in the grain truck cab: "Someone else's rope. Never let someone else hold your rope." Let me tell you about the almost quit moment, because Nelson had one, and it was not during the crisis. It was in 1980, at the peak of the land price boom, when everything around him was telling him he was wrong to be the farmer running old equipment when everyone else was upgrading. In 1980, the agricultural economy in Randolph County was producing the kind of confidence that was, in retrospect, the specific confidence that precedes a crisis. Corn was at $3.65. Land was at $2,100 per acre. Every dealer in the county was running upgrade promotions, and every bank was willing to lend against rising land values. The farmer with old equipment and a small operation and a paid-for farm was, in the prevailing atmosphere of 1980, the farmer who was falling behind. Nelson had felt this. He had been at the Parker City elevator in the fall of 1980 when two of his neighbors, Harvey Kellerman and the Waters boy, who ran his father's expanded operation, had been discussing the new equipment they had bought and the additional ground they had leased and the plans they had for the following year. He had listened. He had driven home in a truck that was older than their planters. He had sat at his kitchen table that evening with his operating notebook. He had written at the top of a page what Everett said. He had then written the sentence in full: "Never let someone else hold your rope." He had then written, "Whose rope am I holding?" He had listed every financial obligation on the farm: land taxes, crop insurance, fuel and seed and fertilizer, paid with cash on delivery, parts, and maintenance, his operating line of credit, which he had never drawn more than $12,000 in a single year and had always cleared before the following season. He had looked at the list. Every obligation on it was either a fixed cost with no lender involved or a credit arrangement that his farm's revenue could service at $2 corn, considerably below the $3.65 corn he was actually getting that year. He was holding his own rope entirely. Harvey Kellerman was not entirely holding his. The Waters operation was not entirely holding its. Nelson had closed the notebook. He had gone to bed. He had not bought the new machine in 1980 or 1981. He had watched his neighbors buy them and had understood that in 1980 and 1981 the new machines were not wrong choices by the information available in 1980 and 1981. They were choices that looked rational at $3.65 corn and 1980 land values. They looked different at $2.42 corn and falling land values. His father's sentence had been said in 1972, when corn was not $3.65 and land was not $2,100 per acre. Everett had not said it as a prediction of a specific crisis. He had said it as a principle that was true regardless of what corn was doing and what land was doing and what the dealers were promoting and what the banks were willing to lend. The principle was independent of conditions. That was what made it a sentence rather than advice. Advice is conditional. A sentence is true in all conditions. Never let someone else hold your rope. This sentence is true when corn is $3.65. It is true when corn is $2.42. It is true when interest rates are 8% and when they are 21%. It is true when land is appreciating and when it is falling. It is not advice about any specific condition. It is a statement about a relationship. The relationship between the farmer and the people or institutions who hold the financial obligations attached to the farm. That has a specific consequence regardless of conditions. When someone else holds the rope, they can pull it. They can pull it when the conditions are bad, and the pulling is the worst possible moment for the farmer at the other end of the rope. They can pull it not because they want to harm the farmer, but because the institution that holds the rope has its own conditions, its own regulators, its own capital requirements, its own obligation to its own rope holders that require it to pull when certain thresholds are breached. Harvey Kellerman's lender had not wanted to pull Harvey's rope. The lender had pulled it because the lender's own conditions required it, because the combined debt service ratio on Harvey's equipment note and operating credit and the land values that had declined since the note was signed had breached the threshold that required the lender to act. Harvey had not known, when he signed the equipment note in 1979, that the lender's conditions would change in ways that would require pulling the rope in 1985. He had not been able to know this. Nobody had known it in 1979. Everett had known in a different way in 1972 that lenders pull ropes when their conditions require it, and that the farmer at the other end of the rope has no control over when that happens. He had not predicted the 1985 crisis. He had understood the rope. He had said, "When you owe, someone else holds the rope." He had said, "Never let someone else hold your rope." He had said this to a 16-year-old boy in a grain truck cab in the summer of 1972. The boy had become a man who held his own rope through the 3 years that took 3 farms on his road. Let me tell you about the 3 farms, because the 3 farms deserve to be understood in their specificity, rather than summarized as casualties of a crisis. The Brinker farm had been the first one Everett had pointed at on that July afternoon in 1972. It had been exactly what Everett had said it was. 3 ropes in someone else's hands. All 3 pulled simultaneously when the conditions required. The Brinker boy, Clem Brinker, who was 35 in 1985, had been a good farmer. He had produced above county average yields across his tenure on the ground his family had farmed since his grandfather's time. He had expanded because the conditions of the late 1970s had seemed to make expansion sensible. He had not been wrong about any specific decision by the information available at the time of the decision. He had simply been in a position where his lenders held 3 ropes, and all 3 were pulled in the same 2-year period. He had sold the farm in 1986. He had moved to Muncie. He had worked in agricultural supply for 20 years and had retired there. He had not been broken by it. He had been resilient and had built a different life. but he had not farmed again. The Kellerman farm had been taken over by the lender in 1987 after 2 years of restructuring attempts that had ultimately not succeeded. Harvey had stayed in Randolph County and had eventually rented ground from a neighbor, not his own ground, and had continued farming at a smaller scale until his retirement. The Waters operation had been the largest loss, 480 acres that had been in the Waters family since 1921, sold at a loss in 1986 to satisfy the combined expansion debt. The Waters family had left Randolph County. The ground was still being farmed by a different family. 3 farms, 3 sets of ropes in other hands, 3 different specific stories that all arrived at the same outcome when the conditions required the pulling. Nelson Coble farmed 280 Randolph County acres through 1985, 1986, 1987, and every year after, the same 280 acres with the same equipment maintained with the same discipline. He was not unaffected by the crisis. Corn at $2.42 on a 280-acre farm is a difficult year regardless of debt structure, and difficult years are difficult. But he was not broken by it. His lenders had no ropes to pull. His operating credit line had a balance he could service at $2 corn. His equipment was paid for. His land was paid for. He held his own rope. Let me tell you the last thing, which is what happened when Nelson drove past the Brinker farm in the summer of 1988, 2 years after Clem Brinker had sold it and moved to Muncie. The farm had been bought by a neighbor and had been folded into a larger operation. The white farmhouse was being rented to a family from Winchester. The red equipment barn had been repainted a different shade of red that was not quite the color Clem Brinker's father had used. The field behind it had corn in it, the same way it had had corn in it in 1972 when Everett Coble had driven past and said, "Look at that place." Nelson had driven past at approximately the same speed his father had driven past in 1972. He had been in a grain truck coming back from the elevator the same trip. He had looked at the Brinker farm as he drove past. He had thought about his father in the cab of the grain truck in 1972 saying, "That farm is going to be in trouble in 3 years." He had thought about the sentence. He had thought about the 3 farms on his road and the 3 sets of ropes that had been pulled. He had thought about Clem Brinker in Muncie and Harvey Kellerman renting someone else's ground and the Waters family gone from the county entirely. He had thought about the 280 acres he was still farming, the equipment he still owned outright, the operating account that was full from a year when corn at $2.95 had been an improvement over the crisis years. He had driven past the Brinker farm without stopping. He had continued to his own farm. He had parked the truck and gone inside. He had thought about calling his father. Everett was 74 in 1988 and was still sharp, and telling him about driving past the Brinker farm and thinking about 1972. He had not called. He had decided that Everett already knew. They had talked around it enough times that the substance of the conversation was known without requiring the specific call. He had thought about his own son, who was 11 in 1988 and who was on the farm every summer and during planting and harvest the same way Nelson had been. He had thought, "The boy is too young for the sentence now. In 5 years, maybe 6, there would be a morning in a grain truck cab coming back from the elevator, and they would pass some farm. He did not know which one, and he would say, Look at that place. And he would say what his father had said. He would say, when you owe, someone else holds the rope. He would say, never let someone else hold your rope. He would say it once. It would be enough. Everett had said it once. It had been enough for 40 years. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, what is the sentence your father said once that has been enough for your whole farming life? 3 farms on his road, 3 sets of ropes in other hands. Nelson held his own. Everett said it once in 1972 in a grain truck cab on a July afternoon. Nelson has been farming behind it for 50 years. The sentence is still true. It will be true this spring. It will be true every spring after that. Never let someone else hold your rope. Let me tell you about what the rope means in precise financial terms, because the sentence is a metaphor, and the metaphor points at something specific, and the specific thing deserves its own accounting. When a farmer borrows to buy a piece of equipment or a parcel of land, or to fund operating costs above what the farm's revenue covers, the lender acquires a specific legal claim against the farm's assets, the specific security interest that allows the lender to act if certain conditions are breached. The lender does not hold the farm. The lender holds the rope. The farmer is at one end, the lender is at the other. In normal times, the rope is slack. The farmer operates the farm, makes the payments, the lender receives them. Nobody thinks about the rope. The rope is so slack in normal times that most farmers stop thinking about the fact that it exists. They experience the loan as a monthly payment, not as a rope. In abnormal times, when commodity prices fall or interest rates rise or land values drop, the rope can tighten. The conditions in the loan agreement that protect the lender's position become relevant. The debt service coverage ratio, the loan-to-value ratio, the operating account balance requirements. These are the specific points at which the rope can be said to have been pulled when the lender's conditions require action. The farmer at the other end of the rope did not choose the moment of the pulling. The farmer chose to take the rope when the rope was slack. The moment of the pulling was determined by conditions outside the farmer's control, the commodity markets, the interest rate environment, the appraisal of the land, and by the lender's own conditions, which are themselves determined by factors outside both the farmer's and the lender's individual control. Everett Coble had understood this in 1952, and he decided not to sign equipment notes. He had understood it not from economics textbooks, but from watching specific farms around him go through specific versions of this experience across the previous 20 years. The Depression, which had been the most dramatic episode of rope pulling in American agricultural history, and the smaller crisis cycles of the 1940s and early 1950s that had caught farmers who had not learned from the Depression. He had watched enough pulling to understand the rope. He had said, when you owe, someone else holds the rope. He had not said, never borrow. He had said, never let someone else hold your rope. The distinction is important. There is a difference between borrowing that is structured so that no single lender or combination of lenders can pull the rope in a way that threatens the farm's existence, and borrowing that puts the farm's existence within the reach of a lender's action. The first kind of borrowing is available. The second kind is the rope. Nelson had understood this from the sentence. He had applied it consistently. He had borrowed. He had used operating credit every year, had financed the 1980 tractor purchase for a short period, before paying it off from that fall's harvest. But he had never been in a position where a lender could pull a rope that threatened the farm. His operating credit was always within the range that one bad year could service. His land was paid for before any additional borrowing was considered. His equipment carried no notes. The ropes he held were manageable, and he held them himself. Harvey Kellerman's ropes had been held by three separate institutions: the equipment lender, the operating credit lender, and the land note lender, and when the conditions required pulling, all three had pulled within 18 months of each other. No single pull would have ended the farm. The combination had. This is the specific mechanism that Everett's sentence describes. Not dead in the abstract. The specific vulnerability of having multiple ropes in other hands simultaneously, such that the actions required by one lender's conditions interact with and compound the actions required by the others. Nelson had kept all his ropes. When the crisis hit, there was nothing to pull. Let me tell you about what Nelson's son did with the sentence, because the sentence has now passed to a third generation, and the third generation's version of it says something about how principles travel through families. Nelson's son Owen had been 11 in 1988 when Nelson had driven past the former Brinker farm and thought about when to say the sentence. Owen had been 17 when Nelson had finally said it, in a grain truck cab coming back from the elevator in the summer of 1994, passing the farm that Harvey Kellerman was renting from someone else, rather than farming his own ground. Nelson had said, "Owen, look at that." Owen had said, "Harvey Kellerman's truck is over there." Nelson had said, "That's not Harvey's farm anymore." Owen had been quiet. He had said, "I know." Nelson had said, "His lender pulled the rope." Owen had said, "What do you mean?" Nelson had said, "When you owe, someone else holds the rope." He had looked at the road. He had said, "Harvey's lender held 3 ropes and pulled them all in 1986 and 1987. He paused. He said, "Your grandfather said that to me in 1972, passing the Brinker farm." He had looked at Owen. He had said, "Never let someone else hold your rope." Owen had been 17. He had heard it. He had not needed to hear it more than once. Owen farms the 280 Randolph County acres today. He has added 80 acres, a parcel that came available in 2003 when another farm on the road was liquidated through an estate, purchased with cash from the operating account, no note. The farm is 360 acres. The equipment is paid for. The land is paid for. His operating credit line has never been drawn beyond what 2 bad years in sequence could service. He has never let someone else hold his rope. He told me about the grain truck cab in 1994 when I asked him what his father had said to him about farming. He said he told me about my grandfather telling him the same thing in 1972. He paused. He said, it was the same story, 1 generation back. He had said, "I think the sentence is the whole thing." He had paused. The sentence is everything my grandfather knew about staying on the farm, compressed into 13 words. He had counted them. When you owe, someone else holds the rope. Never let someone else hold your rope. 2 sentences, 13 words total. He had said, "My grandfather said it once. My father said it once." He looked at his son, who was 9 years old and on the farm every summer and during planting and harvest. He had said, "I'll say it once." The sentence is waiting for the right grain truck cab moment on a Randolph County road. It has been waiting since 2022. when Owen started thinking about when his son was old enough to receive it. He will not rush it. The moment will be when they are driving past a farm on the road. He does not know which one. And the farm will say something about what the rope can do when someone else holds it. And Owen will say, "Look at that place." And the sentence will pass to the fourth generation. Everett said it once in 1972. Nelson said it once in 1994. Owen will say it once to his son. One sentence, 3 generations of farming without losing the rope. The sentence is 13 words, and it is worth more than any equipment upgrade, any land expansion, any operating credit draw that the sentence has kept them from signing. When you owe, someone else holds the rope. Never let someone else hold your rope. 3 farms on Nelson's Road did not survive the 1980s crisis. The Cobble farm did. The sentence is the reason. The sentence has been the reason for 50 years. It will be the reason for 50 more. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer. One sentence. Said once, enough for a farming life. Said again, once, enough for the next one. That is how the important things travel. Once, in a grain truck cab on a county road, driving past a farm that is showing you what the rope looks like when someone else pulls it.